As we have seen in our previous chapters, the Cantina scene made a lasting impact on fans, and even though it wasn't officially given any coverage in the early days of Star Wars, see Chapter 7, it quickly cemented itself firmly into pop culture. Today, we will take a look at the various other places it appeared in those early days, outside of movie theaters, beginning with comics. Without a doubt, one of the most important early Star Wars products was the Marvel Comics adaptation, which launched a title that continued to 107 issues. In a strategic move, the comic began a few months before the film debuted in theaters, allowing the story to be half completed by the time the film was released and building interest among its excited readers. Written by Roy Thomas and drawn by Howard Chaykin, with additional art by Steve Leialoha, the risky adaptation was a great success and lived on in reprintings, including giant-sized treasuries, which this author read until they were in tatters. The Cantina scene appears in issue 2, entitled 6 Against the Galaxy, and even though Marvel was very limited in the reference material they received, the scene is still represented very well. Let's jump in. Once Ben warns Luke about the Cantina, Luke is suddenly in trouble in the very next panel. Note that Nagola Dewagi Wooldugger Note that what the alien says is verbatim from the actual script, and so is the "Don't insult us" line. Wait, who said that? Did you notice that Luke has 3 attackers, as in the finished, revised 4th draft script, one of them being a small rodent? And Marvel also seems to share the notion that our little friend Cabe fits that description perfectly. In 2013, when Dark Horse adapted the rough draft screenplay into a comic called The Star Wars, they too used Cabe as one of the attackers, who runs away after the fight. It's lucky for us that the fight didn't turn out this way in the actual film, otherwise we wouldn't have the Cabe we know and love, who is a girl. The next panel tells us that Ben has cut 2 of the aggressors to pieces. Oh, and there is a hand on the floor. Directly after the fight, the comic skips Boshek entirely and has Obi-Wan introduce Luke to Chewbacca. Is it just me, or does he look very much like David Hasselhoff here? I have always thought that. The remainder of the scene is very well done, especially Greedo, and is also interesting for the background aliens, who are sometimes creatively depicted, sometimes invented. It's also famous for its depiction of Jabba the Hutt, with 1 T, which goes back to the lack of reference materials mentioned earlier, and of course proves above all else that Lucas did not have all of the movies written ahead of time, or know what Jabba even looked like at the time of the first film, or for years afterward, as Marvel was allowed to use this Jabba twice more, even as far as 1980. But since this isn't the Jabba Compendium, we should probably move on. We need to leave Marvel momentarily and look at a fanzine called Rocket's Blast Comic Collector, who in issue 139, published in October 1977, printed a scathing full-page article by James Van Hise entitled Star Wars Marvel Style, Where It Went Wrong. Although less critical of Roy Thomas's writing, Van Hise complained that Chaykin's artwork was disappointing, especially concerning Obi-Wan's fight in the Cantina. Why then, when he drew it, did he pick, virtually without exception, all the most uninteresting angles to portray it in a composition which made the scene come across as incidental, instead of as one of the most talked about sequences in the film? Van Hise also said he was so frustrated that he asked artist Kerry Gamble to redraw the 2 pages we just looked at, to show how interesting it should have been, basing his portrayal on both the novel as well as the finished film. This resulted in a much more violent sequence, which, in all honesty, probably would never have seen the light of day in a mainstream comic book at that time, but is still amazing on its own, and a rare Star Wars comic that lots of collectors don't know about. The first thing we notice is that the artist definitely had the advantage of repeated viewings of the film, which resulted in more accurate aliens. Then we come to the second page, where Obi-Wan hacks up 3 aggressors, and leaves a huge mess for somebody to clean up. Interestingly, before the fanzine went to print, they sent both the Van Hise article and Gamble's artwork to Roy Thomas at Marvel, giving Thomas enough time to write a response, which they included in the actual issue. Thomas, of course, defends Marvel's adaptation, saying they had little to no reference materials to work with, going on to say that he left the Star Wars comic entirely after issue 7 because he felt vaguely abused by Star Wars Corporation, which wanted me to somehow read George Lucas's mind from afar and come up with precisely what he would do or want done in a given situation, when in point of fact, it took him 6 years, several totally different plots, and various collaborators to achieve the movie you saw on the screen. Unfortunately, that 7th issue was the first new material after the conclusion of the movie's adaptation, where Thomas created Jackson, the 6-foot-tall rabbit who talked like Bugs Bunny. For our purposes here, the Cantina scene had a connection to this, too. In Marvel's fan club magazine Foom, number 21, the cover of which gives us another Marvel depiction of the Cantina scene. He says, "One of the characters in the bar sequence, in fact, reminded me of Porky Pig, which sparked me to create the Green Rabbit." We are left to wonder which character that even was. The Rocket's Blast issue also appears to be the very first place to publish a parody comic of the film, which they called Star Woes. The Cantina scene here amounts to 3 panels. Many parodies followed. Cracked magazine continued this trend next, in November of 1977, with issue 146. Crazy number 32's Star Warts appeared in December of 1977, and points for Bullwinkle. In January of 1978, Cracked number 148 gave buyers a Cantina bar poster, if you completely ripped off the cover, that is. That same month, Mad finally got into the game with Star Roars in issue 196. Oscar the Grouch is a great touch. In December of 1978, they published The Force and I, the Mad Star Wars musical, in issue 203, with lyrics you can sing to the tune of By the Time I Get to Phoenix. Pause here if you want to sing, of course. January 1980 brings us back to Marvel, where Star Wars number 31 sees Luke back on Tatooine, and therefore, of course, is legally required to revisit the Cantina, where he finds Han, again. This issue is also famous as the very last appearance of the Hutt with 1T. A little-known yet legendary Star Wars comic was produced unofficially in Hungary in 1982 by Horvath Tibor and Attila Fizakis, whose names I am probably butchering. The black and white comic sold 300,000 copies and was later translated into English by a generous fan and put up for download. One interesting component of their Cantina scene has been telling the bartender that he had to defend himself, saying, "What else could I do?" And there's a hand on the floor. The immediate years after Return of the Jedi were dark times for fans, but in 1987, a small comics company named Blackthorn published 3 issues of Star Wars comics, this time in 3D. Sadly, nobody cared, and it didn't help that 3D technology hadn't progressed beyond the 1950s red and blue glasses that cut the backs of your ears and gave you a headache. The first issue featured Luke and company returning to Tatooine in order to find somebody to look after his aunt and uncle's farm, which had been sitting there since the events of the first film. So where else to look but the Mos Eisley Cantina? It all goes downhill from there. This turkey was actually written by the great Len Wein, so go figure. You may recall, way back in Chapter 5, that we showed you a November 1977 Vogue magazine pictorial that oddly combined masks from Star Wars with models wearing fur coats, specifically for our purposes, one snaggletooth. As it turns out, Vogue shares some unused photos from the original shoot on their website. Now, why do you suppose this picture wasn't used? I mean, it's a perfectly good photo and, that gives me the creeps. In the fall of 1977, Lucasfilm allowed Star Wars characters and costumes to be available for use on television shows, and it was a cluster of these appearances in September of that year that actually resulted in a huge resurgence in ticket sales for the film, which was still in theaters. One of these early appearances was on the short-lived Richard Pryor Show, a program so controversial it only lasted 4 weeks on the air. At the very beginning of the first episode is a hilarious segment called Star Wars Bar, and it featured actual costumes and masks from the film, and an octopus monster, all supervised by Rick Baker. If you can imagine replacing customers of an actual inner-city bar with the aliens from the Mos Eisley Cantina, and replacing the bartender with Richard Pryor, then you are prepared for the 5-minute fever dream that is to follow. I only wish I could include it here in its entirety, but it is on YouTube on the official Pryor channel and in excellent quality, so instead let's just pause here and give you time to go and watch it. You won't be disappointed. Okay, we're back. I told you that was amazing. Now let's walk through the highlights. The very first thing we even see is this Bith, wrapped in a bedsheet for some reason. Here, Labria and Erodian sit at a table and kiss passionately? What the? The wife of one Duros calls, and he insists he isn't there. The Wolfman and Yamnose call for a double, which is loudly slurped down. When the Wolfman picks a fight, the bartender calls Fuzz, the bouncer, played by Muftak in pants and suspenders. And how about Don Rickles dancing suggestively for Snaggletooth and being told to get a room? Are we really seeing this? Then the bartender asks a huge octopus monster, who is playing a game, I think, if Labria was the devil, and the octopus monster attacks him. It's Fuzz to the rescue, who drags the monster away. It's just another night in the Star Wars bar. I wonder what George thought of this. As it turns out, all vintage television appearances of the Cantina are completely bonkers, because in 1979, a public service announcement was actually made for the U.S. Department of Transportation using masks and costumes from the Cantina, only filmed in a big, dark room rather than actually building a set. Of course, 30 seconds doesn't allow much time to tell a story. There's a lot to see, and there are lots of quick cuts. This is another example I would love to incorporate here, but as there are many copies of this commercial on YouTube, one even remastered, let's just pause here again and allow you time to take it all in, because I imagine you will watch it more than once to make sure you weren't hallucinating. Starting now. And we're back. I told you. Let's look at some notable moments. One of the very first things we notice is that times are tough for the band, as they are now down to 3 members. There is a quick shot of the barroom with robed figures passing by. We can see both Duros, Muftak, and the Ket Malice alien from the Star Wars Holiday Special, as well as a humanoid bartender that looks like he may be wearing the facial appliance from the Kelbo alien from that show. Here is Ellis Hellrot wearing Bomb Vimden's vest, and Hammerhead with 2 blurry figures in the back. And here is Yamnose with him Dazon. Surely they've built a body for him by now, right? No. Apparently it's just a mask on a stick wrapped in a furry blanket with a dog collar tightened around it. Okay. Speaking of Bomb Vimden, he does a silly peekaboo thing here. Finally, our story begins. Muftak has really tied one on and is demanding more, becoming unruly. One of the Duros notices this. The raw emotion on his face is overwhelming. He puts his arm around his furry friend and helps him off screen. Behind everyone is the Ket Malice alien looking creepy. And then, the Millennium Falcon takes off? What the? Is this supposed to be them leaving? That's the best they could do. Now they're spaceship thieves. Then the moral of the story, made to look like the opening crawl. Note Black Falcon Limited, which was Lucas's short-lived merchandising company name at that time. Brought to you by the U.S. Department of Transportation and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, because all this is going to make people not drink and drive. We have briefly mentioned the best-selling soundtrack album, which originally only included the first Cantina Band track. There are even some contemporary covers of the Cantina Band song that can be found, and here are 4 examples. Most other albums you find containing a cover of the track actually have a cover of this version by Miko. Miko, real name Domenico Minardo, saw Star Wars multiple times and convinced his record company to let him record a disco version of the soundtrack. This idea may sound silly today, but he actually knocked it out of the park, condensing the entire film into one side of an LP and telling the entire story of the movie in a fun 15 minutes. His Star Wars/Cantina Band 45 was a #1 hit single too, which is nothing to sneeze at. We have also already mentioned the great Story of Star Wars LP, whose description of the cantina matches the novel, but hearing Roscoe Lee Brown's narration is a treat. In 1981, Star Wars was brought to National Public Radio in a 13-episode drama that totaled 6 hours. The series was written by the late Brian Daley, whose job it was to flesh out the original details of the film, expanding sequences and devising new ones where needed. Even though the original cantina scene is less than 7 minutes in the movie, in the radio drama it's 14 minutes from Luke's entrance to Greedo's death. Upon entering the cantina, Luke describes it for the listeners in this way. "Will you look at this? I've never seen so many non-humans in one place. There's a Mirian hammerhead over there, and a Stofo lupinoid, couple of Tintin dwarfs. Boy, a lot of the humans don't look human." Additionally, Walrus Man and Dr. Evazan are identified here as Saw-Ki and Rufu, which in later years were explained away as aliases. In Chapter 7, we briefly covered the Kenner cassette for their movie viewer entitled Danger at the Cantina, which condenses the cantina scene into a short, silent loop that the user can crank as fast as they want, forwards or backwards. We also briefly mentioned the first home video release of the scene, Ken Films F64, their 8mm and Super 8 sequel to their smash hit 17-minute sampler of Star Wars scenes. Coming after the Cantina embargo we discussed in Chapter 7, the front of the box proudly proclaimed its inclusion of both the Death Star trench run and the Cantina scene. But what we didn't do in that chapter was read you the description on the back of the box, which chooses Bomb Vimden to represent the whole Cantina, oddly. You have to hear this. One of the spectacular scenes in the film is set in the Cantina, a brawling spaceport bar in which director George Lucas assembles a menagerie of monsters and grotesques. Giant flies, cobras, sea creatures of every kind. What movie were they watching? I hope that you have enjoyed this documentary series, and most of all, I hope that you can say that you learned a thing or two. I leave you with some words to live by, which apply to any entertainment franchise, any great art, and your own special memories as well. Vintage will never let you down. Nobody can ever take it away from you, and it will always be there for you. Don't ever let any person or company tell you that they've replaced it with their own inferior version, because they haven't. They've only made an inferior copy of a great thing. It's still there, just as it was. Those things are temporary, but vintage is forever. Next time! Yes, friends, a bonus episode, Chapter 6.5, gathering some new and important information that has come to light in the last few years. Coming soon to a device near you, so stay tuned.